a Christian musician. He wrote a song, and the chorus, the lyrics to the song go like this. Elvis is dead. Picasso is dead. Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin are dead. Marilyn Monroe is dead. However, Jesus is alive. Plato is dead. Socrates is dead. Aristotle, Immanuel Kant are dead. Nietzsche is dead. Darwin is dead. However, Jesus is alive. Buddha is dead. Muhammad is dead. Gandhi and Haile Selassie are dead. Elijah Muhammad is dead. However, Jesus is alive. Yes? Jesus is alive. The central figure in Christianity is Christ. And the central moments in history for the Christian and the world, the central moments in all history, not just for the Christian but for the world, is the death, the burial, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. Earth-shattering, universe-shaking was the death, the burial, the resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ. Changed it all. And we understand that Jesus' death on the cross is what paid our debt. He paid a debt he did not owe. I owed a debt I could not pay. Right? We needed someone to take our sins away. And he bore those sins, our transgressions, our failures on the cross. 1 Peter 2:24. Every aspect of the life of Christ is important. Yes? Yeah, every aspect of the life of Christ is important. But this morning, we're going to spend some time thinking about the resurrection. Thinking about that period of time when everything was changed. The resurrection was something that was prophesied. It was something that was proclaimed or preached, and it was something that was fulfilled. It happened. When we speak of prophecy, when we speak of foretelling of future events, we have a couple ways that the Old Testament deals with that, does that. One is by a direct statement, just stating things, maybe even in plain language. For example, in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, we have the prophecy, the prediction of the Messiah to come. It's the first time in all the Bible that the gospel is preached, is in Genesis 3:15. And who preaches it? God does. God preaches the gospel the first time. In Genesis 3:15, God speaking to Satan says, I will put enmity between you, Satan, and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He, masculine, singular, he will bruise your head or crush your head, and you will bruise or crush his heel. There's somebody coming one day who's going to take you out. He's going to undo all that you have helped and contributed to do. So the gospel is preached there, but you notice it's in many ways it's plain language. It's not mystified. There's coming one day someone who's going to do this. Another way that the Old Testament prophesies something is by what's called types and shadows. A type or a shadow can be a person or an event. For example, Joseph in the book of Genesis. Joseph goes down into Egypt. He's a type of Christ. He's a foreshadowing of Jesus to come for different reasons. But for one reason is he's sold into slavery. He's sold by his brothers. Joseph is sold by his brothers. And yet, Joseph ends up saving his brothers, his family. Jesus is sold by Judas, isn't he? Judas is his brother according to the flesh. He was a Jew. He's sold by his brother according to the flesh, and yet he saves. He saves all those who would come to him. He saves repentant Jews who would come to embrace him. Of course, there's differences between Joseph and Jesus. Joseph saved his family and all that were connected to him. Jesus not only saves those who would come to him who are of his earthly flesh, the Jews, but all Gentiles, anyone who comes to him would be saved. But you see, Joseph is a picture, he's a shadow of Jesus Christ. So the old covenant system of things as well, the laws, the tabernacle, they were all shadows of things to come. They were all pointing us to a greater reality, to a greater person. Listen to what Paul says in Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. Paul says this, he says, "Therefore let no one pass judgment on you in question of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, a new moon, or a Sabbath." What's he talking about? He's talking about the Old Covenant law, the Old Covenant system. They had dietary restrictions, didn't they? Can't eat shellfish. Can't eat pork. Right? There were commandments based on what you would eat or drink. Paul says, don't let anybody judge you in question to that. They had festivals, they had new moons, they had Sabbaths, they had all these holy days, didn't they? All of that. So Paul says, the whole Old Testament, he goes on, he says, don't let anybody judge you in regard to those Old Covenant laws, those festivals, those new moons, and all of that. He goes on to say, these are a shadow of things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. He was saying the Old Covenant system was a picture. It was pointing forward to Jesus. They point forward to him in some form or some fashion. A shadow, a foreshadowing, is something that predicts an event before it happens, or in some way describes a person to come. Think about biblical shadows, like if you were walking down the street and all of a sudden you looked on the ground and there was a shadow of a plane going by. Right? You see that before the plane flies overhead. Well, that shadow is predicting something. It's telling you something is coming. But the shadow is not the reality, right? It's pointing forward. There's something coming. And in fact, you know what's interesting is, you look at that picture, the shadow doesn't have all the details, does it? No, it doesn't give you all the details. It's a shadow. But it gives you the general outline, the general shape. This is what's coming. And then, eventually, we see the plane overhead. And we see the details and the intricacies and all of that. That's how we can think about the Old Testament shadows. Not all the details are the same, right? The life of Joseph, while it's a picture of Christ to come, it's foreshadowing, it's pointing us towards Jesus to come, not all the details are there. They're not. But that's the nature of a shadow. It's not meant to show you all the details. I'll give you an example. For example, we see the resurrection foreshadowed in the events that Jonah underwent when he was swallowed by the fish. In Jonah chapter 1, verse 17, we read this. 1:17, "And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. In the New Testament, this is shown to be a picture of what Jesus was going to go through. In Matthew chapter 12 and verse 40, Jesus himself said, "For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." See, Jonah is a picture of what was going to happen with Christ. Picture of the resurrection. He was in the belly of the fish for 3 days and 3 nights, and then he was vomited up. Jesus will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth, and he will rise up. There's some differences, but you see the big picture. The big picture is pointing us to Christ. And the resurrection of Christ was not only foreshadowed in the events of Jonah, but was also predicted in certain Old Testament passages. We talked about that, how Old Testament prophecies are different ways. Sometimes they're in events that happen, and sometimes it's just words that are spoken to prophesy, to predict. So if we look at Psalm 16, verses 8 through 11, we read this: "I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I shall not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad, and my whole being rejoices. My flesh also dwells secure. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol," that is, to the grave, "or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forever." Well, the New Testament quotes that. And it applies this to Jesus' resurrection. In Acts chapter 13, verses 34 through 37, we read, "And as for the fact that he raised him," God raised Jesus, "from the dead, no more to return to corruption, he has spoken in this way: I will give you the holy and sure blessings of David. Therefore, he says also in another psalm, you will not let your Holy One see corruption." For David, after he had served the purpose of God in his own generation, fell asleep and was laid with his fathers and saw corruption. But he whom God raised up did not see corruption. See, this shows the resurrection indeed was prophesied. We have pictures, we have shadows, and we have direct statements that the New Testament writers interpreting as referring to the resurrection. The Old Testament prophesied that there would be one to come, one who would bring life from death. That death would not be the end. He would rise from the grave. Up from the grave he arose, with a mighty triumph for his foes he arose. Isaiah 53. You ever read that? Isaiah 53. If you've never read that, read that. If you have read it, read that. Go and read that. It's all predicting what was going to happen with Christ. The resurrection of Christ was prophesied in the Old Testament in all kinds of places. We've only touched on a few. And in the New Testament, the resurrection was announced. In fact, it was announced by Jesus himself. Jesus made more than one reference to his being raised from the dead. He talked about it on a number of occasions. In Matthew chapter 16, verse 21, it says, "From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised." He was telling them about the resurrection. In John chapter 2, 19 through 21, Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It's taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. Resurrection. The Old Testament predicted that Jesus would rise from the dead. The New Testament proclaimed it. He's going to rise from the dead. But none of that matters, right? None of that matters if it wasn't fulfilled. You can have predictions all you want, right? You can have people proclaiming, Jesus is going to rise from the dead. You can have Jesus say it himself. But it means nothing if it doesn't come to pass, right? It means absolutely nothing. I could tell you, I am going to go to the moon tomorrow. You could say, I could even say, look, I've got prophecy years ago, whatever. But if I don't go to the moon, it means nothing, right? False prophet or whatever. I'm not going to the moon tomorrow, but you get the point, right? So the resurrection is meaningless if it never took place, right? You can have prophecy about it, you can have Jesus proclaiming it, but we want to know, did it happen? And of course, it happened. The resurrection of Christ happened. It's historically reliable. You can look at the history behind it. In Matthew chapter 28, 1 through 6, we have angels announcing it. It says, now after the Sabbath, towards the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, his clothing white as snow. And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus, who was crucified. He's not here, for he is risen. As he said, come, see the place where he lay. Here we have divine beings, messengers. We have angels coming and proclaiming the resurrection. You know what's interesting? We don't have time to talk about it today. But you know who announced the birth of Christ? Angels. Angels announced the birth of Christ, right? Here at the resurrection, who's announcing it? Angels are announcing it. Angels are announcing the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Of course, you have the women. In verses 8 through 10 of the same chapter, we read about the women. It says, so they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy and ran to tell the disciples. And behold, Jesus met them and said, greetings. And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. And Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. And there they will see me. So the women are witnesses to the resurrection, and they announce it to the disciples. From these verses, we also see that Jesus himself appears and confirms it. Right? It's not just angels saying, look at the empty tomb, but Jesus comes up and talks to the women and says, here I am. Go and tell everybody I've raised from the dead. We even have Jesus appearing to the disciples, not just to these women, but to the disciples. In John chapter 20, verses 26 through 28, it says, 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands, and put your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe. Thomas answered, my Lord and my God. The resurrected Christ comes and presents himself before Thomas and is willing to be touched. Whether Thomas touched him or not, we don't know, but is willing to be touched. So Jesus comes and proclaims it himself. And then again, we could talk about all the historical facts surrounding this. We know that Jesus was crucified historically under Pilate. That's history. We know that. We get that from secular history, not just the Bible. We know that the women come to the tomb. We know there's an empty tomb. We know there's all of these kind of facts that go along with that. It's a historical reality. The question is, so what though? One scholar said, yeah, Jesus rose from the dead. But he said, so what? Weird things happen. Wasn't a Christian, didn't believe in Jesus, whatever. So we want to ask, so what? Even if Jesus rose from the dead, what does that mean? Well, first of all, it means that the Scriptures can be trusted. You see, if hundreds and thousands of years before Jesus ever walked on the scene, the Scriptures are prophesying about it, and then it comes to pass, that seems to suggest that they're reliable, right? It's telling the truth. It's reliable, so we can look to the Scriptures as reliable. In fact, there's more than 300 prophecies concerning Jesus, concerning the Christ in the Old Testament. More than 300. Do you know that it is statistically impossible for somebody to just accidentally fulfill 8? How impossible it is to fulfill 300 by accident. There's confirmation. There's confirmation that the Bible is accurate. And of course, the resurrection of Christ proves that the Bible is true because it prophesied about it hundreds and thousands of years before it ever happened. It also shows us that Jesus can be trusted. That whatever Jesus says, we can believe. Jesus said, I'm going to be killed. I'm going to spend 3 days in the tomb, but I'm going to come and be raised to life. And he did it. So he's trustworthy. If he says something, he'll do it. And clearly he's got the ability and the power to do it. All authority in heaven and on earth, he said, was given to him. So he can be trusted. The Scriptures can be trusted. But here's something else. That little video that we watched. See, the resurrection changes everything. The resurrection of Christ changes everything. What can the world do to Christians? All they can do is take our life, right? They can torture us, and at the end of the day, they can take our life. And what's going on with some of these people? We saw it. They're losing their lives, right? But see, Christians know that there's more, and that we serve the Creator of the universe. The one who raised Jesus from the dead says, you and I too will be raised to life one day. Death is defeated. Death is defeated in Jesus. Now, did you hear me? No, stop for a moment. I know we're not being persecuted like what we saw. But does death come knocking at your door? Sure it does. Sure it does. Comes knocking at my door. Listen. If you can't get excited, if you can't rejoice, and I'm not saying you can't, but think about it for a moment. Death is defeated. Because Jesus rose, he said, I will make sure you who are connected with me will rise again as well. And the church said, Amen. And we can rejoice even in the midst of death. When we watch videos like that and we rejoice that people who name the name of Jesus, listen, if they kill us, God has defeated death. Proof is in the resurrection of Jesus. What can the enemies do? Nothing. Because we're going to come up out of the grave. They can do nothing. What are we afraid of? Nothing. Who can harm us? No one. Even if they kill us. To live is Christ and to die is gain. They can't do anything to us, ultimately. Does the resurrection change anything? Changes everything. Everything. Why do we eat the supper every week? Multiple reasons. Layers. We've talked about that. But one of the reasons we eat it every week is because we need to be reminded that death is defeated. Cancer comes knocking at your door. Accidents. Children die. People die in car accidents. People are tortured and killed in foreign countries for Jesus. Death comes knocking. And each and every week, God has given us the ability to what? Be reminded that Jesus rose, and you and I will rise too. Death is a defeated foe. You and I have something to rejoice about, don't we?
Amen.
Have something to proclaim from the rooftops. You know what one of the biggest fears people have in life? Who's got the answer? Jesus. And we do. We've got the answer, right? Let me tell you about the one who rose from the dead. And promises that you too will rise. Look at this text. I'm going to end with this. And the church rejoiced. 1 Corinthians 15, 51 to 52. Mark this down. Write it down. Highlight it. Whatever you got to do. I don't care. Keep this in your mind. Behold, Paul says, behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep. That is, die. But we shall all be changed. In a moment. In the twinkling of an eye. At the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised imperishable. And we shall be changed. Is that good news?
Hallelujah.
That's good news. That's good. We're about good news. I want to give you good news today. Jesus rose from the dead. Promises that you too will rise from the dead if you stay connected to Him. Man, let that brighten your day. Let that brighten your week. Regardless of what you go through. Regardless of what happens this week. And sometimes it's difficult and dark. But regardless, right? Friday. We might be in the midst of Friday, but Sunday's coming. Resurrection Day. Resurrection Day. Let's pray.